Epistemology, which is a big fancy word, but it just means the study of how you know what you know, the study of beliefs, literally, or of knowledge. So last week we talked all about epistemology, what it is and why it matters, which is, you think about this kind of thing all the time. What basis do you make your truth claims on what basis do you find things plausible, all of that sort of thing. And what we talked about is that our culture has a very specific and neurotic relationship to epistemology, very different than any previous culture, and we implicated René Descartes in a lot of this issue, and we discussed him in depth. Now, I got some feedback, some of it was a little technical, went a little fast. If you didn't quite follow all of it last time, don't worry, we're going to spend the rest of the series breaking all of that down. But I just wanted to kind of put him front and center, since he's the main person that people usually blame this on. But of course, nobody is just an isolated entity. He's a product of his times. And we are going to talk about all the other things that are going on at this point in history. And today we're going to talk about Martin Luther, which you may not have expected. You may not have expected that he's sort of a twin part of our cultural legacy when it comes to doubt and skepticism, ironically enough. How is that possible? We will see today. But real quick, if you're listening to this episode on YouTube or Spotify or AFR or somewhere else, and that's the only place that you listen to The Roots of Everything, you're actually missing a third of the Roots of Everything episodes. There's 2 extra episodes in every series. The rest are on Substack. You can go to zacharyporcu.substack.com, and the rest of the episodes are there. There'll be a link in the description or something like that. Okay, so I want to quickly review last week just to make sure we have a solid footing on it, because we did a lot last week, and we talked about all of this kind of doubt stuff and Descartes and his relationship to doubt and to the medieval world and these things. So very briefly, the main takeaways were that previous cultures, especially our previous culture, the Middle Ages, and the ancient world before that, generally did not assume that knowing things was inherently problematic. Meaning, they didn't go like, what if I'm really seeing a chair or not? Or what if you heard this like middle school question, what if the way I see red isn't the way you see red? It's just like all of these kind of, or what if we're in a simulation? All these kinds of questions that are these interesting what ifs, but that there are no proof for any of them. Those are the kind of questions that haunt modernity, our modern secular world, but they weren't really haunting the ancients in the same way. And when we talked about Descartes, we talked about how his method, what kind of started all of this and made it popularized among philosophers and then trickled down to the rest of culture, was his idea was, listen, if anything can be doubted, it must be doubted. If it's the faintest possibility that something could be false, you just assume it's false. You just go for it. And there's problems with that, and we're going to spend a lot of the rest of the series talking about exactly what and why and what the alternatives are, so don't worry about that yet. But a couple important elements in this that I want you to have in mind as we go forward and look at Luther and the Reformation is that what Descartes is doing when he says, if it can be doubted, it should be doubted, is that he is doing 2 things. One is he's assuming that there is some kind of a gap between the knower, that's you thinking, and the known, meaning whatever you're trying to understand. Like, I'm seeing a chair, that's the thing you want to know. And he assumes there's a gap between these 2 things, that it's somehow inherently problematic and worthy of suspicion. I see a chair, but maybe it's not really there. You know, like there's that doubt that's going on in the background. And in order to have that kind of doubt, you have to assume that just because you see it doesn't mean it's real. And his basis for that is that sometimes we're dreaming and we think we're awake, or there's hallucinations or mirages or things like that. And so he's like, aha, the senses sometimes trick you. Therefore, what if they're always tricking you? You know, that's kind of the jump that he's making. But again, that means you have to be suspicious of the relationship between the knower and the known. The alternative, you're like, well, what's the alternative? And the alternative is, you could just assume that your faculties work most of the time except when there are mistakes. But he's like, no, maybe they're never working right at all. And the second thing that he does, therefore, is that he says, okay, the way to solve this problem is we need a method. A method is what solves this problem. In his case, it's rationalism, it's reason. He wants to do proofs. He wants to show that contradictions can, tell us, oh, if it's a contradiction, it's not true. The example from last week was, if I think the phrase, I don't exist, it's a contradiction, because of course, who is thinking that thought if it's true? Yada, 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 yada. That was last week. So, problematic gap between the knower and the known. We don't know what's going on. We don't really perceive the world as it is. We perceive some sort of appearance of the world. And the way that we verify that that's what's really going on is we use a method. In his case, rationalism. Later, they're going to add the scientific method to it. Yada, yada, yada. Okay, so why is it that this one guy who's come up with this one particular idea, how did that suddenly result in the complete neurotic, chronic skepticism culture that we have today? And that's obviously not the whole story. So there's a lot of other things that are going on, and we're going to explore the medieval background to that, and I think episode 5. And today we're going to, and next week we're going to talk about the Enlightenment and how they kind of capitalized on all this Newton and Kant and everything. Where does all this go after Descartes? But what I want to do is jump back before Descartes today to the Reformation, because it's not sufficient that one philosopher could just come up with this idea and it suddenly catches fire and changes the entire course of a civilization. Something else had to be going on beforehand. And what I want to suggest to you, as we say in academia, you don't prove things, you just suggest things, right? Is we didn't just wake up and start doubting everything and find the idea of radical, neurotic, skeptical doubt to be plausible. We didn't just wake up one day and decide to do that. Something had to happen first. We actually had to lose our religion first. Our entire basis of certainty had to disappear as a civilization before this kind of radical skepticism would really make any sense. How did that happen? Well, if you listen to our secularism series and the birth of secularism, you know that there are a lot of factors, and one of them was the Reformation. And we talked in that series. If you haven't listened to it, it's great. Go back and check it out. We go into a lot more detail. But the problem with the Reformation is that it ultimately resulted in a secular Europe. And the reason for that is that it took, and again, there's a lot of variables to this, but one of the central epistemology reasons, because that's what this series is about, is that it took religion and it changed religion from something that was the purview of a community, that was objective and outside of the self, and turned it into something that was subjective and internal to the self. What does that mean? We'll talk about this. And I want to say as a preface to that, this, you have to appreciate the situation that we're in with Protestantism today, which is that even though evangelical Christians or quote unquote fundamentalist Christians will say religion is so simple, just follow the Bible, that's just not at all clear. What does that mean? Follow the Bible. The Bible's not a rule book, and the rules that are in it, nobody follows. Not even Orthodox Jews follow the laws of Moses, because they can't, because there's no temple. We've talked about that a lot. So right now, Protestantism is kind of a mess. There's tens of thousands of denominations. Literally, Pew Research Center estimates between 30 and 50. That's a lot. And the differences aren't trivial. There's many competing ideologies. There's no clarity on doctrinal lines. Everybody has a different opinion about it. And even within a denomination, you get different people, and they're like, well, I interpret this thing differently than you do. And when you think about this and you're around it enough, you start to realize, oh, there's no certainty to doctrine. There's a lack of certainty about it. Why do we have all this lack of certainty? There's no outside thing to verify our doctrinal commitments, our doctrine beliefs, even though supposedly that thing is the Bible, according to Reformation guys. So why is there this weird contradiction? It's supposed to be all about this external thing that verifies, and then it doesn't actually deliver on that. Okay, so now that we've set the stage, let's talk about Luther. So Martin Luther complicated character. You can read all about him and all. There's many people have talked about his life. We have his journals. We have all sorts of texts from this time because there's the printing press, etc. But what I want to focus on in an epistemology series is that Luther has two major issues to kind of give you background on him. The problem that Luther has is that he is essentially anxious. He has an anxiety problem. And the anxiety problem is that, and why do I want to say it this way? Because a lot of people think of Luther as primarily having institutional concerns or doctrinal concerns. And what that means is, oh, he was mad at the Catholic Church for XYZ thing. He was mad about indulgences. He was mad about yada yada. And that's not really where he's coming from. When we look at his journals, what we see is that the issue that he's starting from is that he is anxious about damnation. He has anxiety about his salvation, and specifically he has anxiety about having certainty about his salvation. And I'm giving you here this kind of famous quote. Luther wrote that he, quote, stood before God as a sinner with an extremely troubled conscience, and I could not be sure that my merit would assuage him. I did not love, no, rather I hated the God who punishes sinners. So, you notice the language here. It's a legal kind of language. It's judgmental. It's very crushing. I didn't know that. I wasn't sure that my merit could assuage him. Can I assuage, like appease, right? This is very intense. And his reaction to this is hatred. He hated the just God who punishes sinners. And this is the context that I think you need to understand Luther in. And so then he has this so-called Reformation epiphany, which is very famous, I'm sure a lot of you know, which is he's reading the Bible, he's searching the scriptures to figure out how to get out of his problem. And he reads Romans 1:17, the just shall live by faith. And to him, this is like a life-changing epiphany, because how he reads this is, all I have to do is have faith. To have faith, meaning belief. If I just believe in and trust God, that's what the just man is. So I don't have to worry about merit. I can just focus on living by faith, by justice, and therefore becoming just and righteous through faith and all this stuff that later gets developed in all sorts of Reformation ideas. So he's worried about having freedom from this problem of merit and guilt. Why? In the face of an angry God. And so realizing in his mind that the just live by faith, he describes in these terms of incredible liberation. He feels freed by this. And let's see here. I have a whole bunch of notes because I did some academic work on this, and Oswald Bayer is somebody who contributed to the Cambridge Companion to Martin Luther, and he says that Luther's starting point is this deeply personal issue. It's not primarily institutional, like I said. It's that he is anxious and scared about damnation, about appeasing an angry God, and he just can't figure out how he can merit to escape the punishment. Now, no, he was a Catholic monk. He was German. Is this a good reading of Catholicism in that time? You can debate that, whether or not, and Catholics will say, yes and no or whatever. But the point is, what did he think? Why did he have this idea? Well, he did, and that was his major focus. And so you have to appreciate what motivates these people when you're dealing with this. So anxiety crisis, okay, how do you solve this problem? How do you live by faith then? And his relief at this was that he learned this fact in his mind that from the Bible. So the promise of the Bible gave him the knowledge that it was faith alone that would save him. And therefore, this changed his entire outlook on theology. I'm oversimplifying. This is what we do here. Underpaid to overgeneralize, I always say. But the point is, there's a saving message. An idea was communicated to him from text, and that gave him relief that he was justified by faith and not by works. So I have a quote here from Gerhard Ebeling, who wrote an introduction to Martin Luther. He says, for Luther, quote, theology consisted, therefore, of the interpretation of the Holy Scripture. The task was completely identified in his mind with the question which constantly pursued him, of his standing in the sight of God. For he never doubted that the will of God is revealed and comprehensible to men solely through the Holy Scripture. Meaning, the text of the Bible now became central because that's where the promise of salvation came from. The Bible, in other words, so you're starting to see where this is going, the Bible as a text ended up guaranteeing salvation because it's the Bible through which this promise comes. It's the Bible that confirms it, that makes this promise to him, that saves him from all his concerns about God. So this is a big shift, actually. Are we going to talk about this later? Yeah, we are. This is a big shift, but I want you to start noticing are the wheels turning about what's going on in terms of he's looking for an intellectual method for achieving what? Certainty. So just like Descartes, he has doubt about something, and he's going to achieve it. He's going to achieve certainty to make the doubt go away using a method. In his case, it's the Bible, because that's where he read this promise that he was going to be justified by faith. So that's where everything changes in the Reformation, because all of a sudden the Bible becomes this thing that is itself a self-sufficient source of truth. Meaning that the Bible, and this is where you get the sola scriptura, the scriptures alone, becomes the whole heart and center of everything, and therefore interpreting it becomes the most important thing. So I have a quote here from Brad Gregory, who is the author of The Unintended Reformation, which is a great piece. He talked about all like 6 different dimensions in which the Reformation affected and was affected by all these things going on in Europe. And he's talking about what's going on with Luther's opinion of the Bible. And he writes, Zwingli too, who was the start of this Anabaptist movement, quote, held the same view, declaring the same view of the Bible, meaning declaring in his 1522 treatise on the clarity and certainty of Scripture that no trust should be given to any word like that given to the Word of God. For it is certain and may not fail. It is clear and it will not leave us to err in darkness. It teaches itself on its own. And if you're watching this on the video, I've put in the original German words in there. He's so clear about the Bible is certain, it doesn't fail, it's clear, and doesn't let us err, and it teaches on its own. It doesn't need anything else. It just teaches you on its own. Just read the Bible. I'm sure you've heard this, and this is where it starts. So studying the Bible becomes the most important thing because it's the source of all truth, according to this new way of looking at Christianity. And so, despite the claims to clarity about these issues, the big problem is that it's not clear, in fact. And that's why all these Reformation guys immediately go to discussions and arguments and ultimately wars about the way to interpret the Bible. So, method. How do you interpret the Bible with the correct method? This is what's sometimes called hermeneutics in biblical studies. How do you interpret? We're going to talk more about that in week 6. Episode 6. But if you follow the right method, it's like a little formula. If you follow the right method, then you will achieve certainty. Read the Bible correctly, and you'll get assurance of salvation. This is the same thing that's going on with Descartes. So we don't know about anything. So I'm going to make the parallelism here. Descartes says, we don't know anything about the world. We don't have certainty about it. Luther, we don't know about our salvation. Then we want certainty about it. Descartes wants certainty about reality. Luther wants certainty about salvation. We use a method to bridge the gap between the certainty gap. For Descartes, it's reason. For Luther, it's biblical interpretation. And then both cases, notice, the method is infallible. Reason is infallible for Descartes. The Bible is infallible for Luther. And he goes so far as to reduce the entirety of the Christian religion to this self-interpreting Bible as the single source for truth about religion. And Descartes radically doubts everything except reason. And we talked a little bit, and a specific kind of reason, rationalism, which is a method of using reason. We'll talk about that later. And this is the same thing that Descartes does. Luther, Descartes. They're just doing it. They're just doing the same thing for the same reasons, in fact. Now, I want to take a minute before we go to break to sort of emphasize the novelty of the Reformation. If you grew up in a Protestant context, or especially if you were raised around evangelical Christians, then or if you are one, then you don't appreciate the extent to which this is really a brand new way of understanding Christianity, meaning historically, this is just a fact of history. There's no proof that anyone in history prior to the Reformation understood the Bible in these exact terms or understood Christianity in these exact terms. There's just no proof for it. And I know a lot of people, a lot of modern day evangelicals will be like, oh, well, this is how they did it in the early church, blah, blah, blah. The early church didn't have a Bible. I have to remind people this all the time. It took decades before all the Gospels and epistles were written, and centuries before they were compiled to be the books of the canon of Scripture. It took longer than the United States has existed for this to happen. So what were the early Christians doing when they didn't have a Bible? Well, they had some other source for their religion because they weren't a text-based religion. I talk about this in my book. If you've heard my lectures, you know this whole thing. But the point is, I have to take a minute to emphasize this, that just factually, this mode of thinking about Christianity as having the truth of the religion, as having its source in a book, was brand new in the 16th century, which is relatively late in Western history. So, and that's not to say the Bible wasn't important. Obviously, it was important. It was massively important. But the old Christianity wasn't conducted as a text-based religion. It was all about what? Saints, holiness, in other words, being a certain way, not just knowing things, because Luther and Descartes end up getting trapped in their heads, but knowledge as incarnational, knowledge as personal, meaning in and through persons, not subjective. We'll talk about that later. But it's like you lived this life. You discipled under somebody directly. This person taught you what the faith was. You went to liturgy. You went to confession. You lived your life. You prayed. You fasted. You did all this stuff. The religion was primarily about a life lived, not about assent. Assent means, what do you agree with? It's like, I agree that Jesus is the Son of God. Okay, great. So did the demons. That's even in Scripture. The assent is not enough. You have to become transformed. And that's all in the New Testament, the Church Fathers, all this kind of stuff. So, somebody in the comments says, I always make the same argument. Protestantism is thoroughly modern. It has nothing to do with historic Christianity. Yeah, it has very little to do with historic Christianity, because this is my point. Nobody said this. Nobody really believed this. Especially they didn't believe it when there was no canon of Scripture. Not that Scripture is not important. That's another topic. So, ironically, this is the irony of all of this. And you said in the commenter I just mentioned, it's thoroughly modern. Yes. In fact, Brad Gregory, in this book that I cited, The Unintended Reformation, and many other scholars say that the Reformation, they really identify the Reformation as the starting point for modernity. The Reformation is the beginning of secularism and secular atheism that's going to come later. That's what was in our spicy thumbnail today, which is true, actually. It sounds like clickbait, but I mean, there's a straight line to it. So, therefore, this is the irony. The post-Reformation kind of Christianity, the Bible-thumping religion, it's actually, from an epistemological standpoint, the same thing as the scientific revolution and the rationalist philosophers. Anxiety about doubt, quest for certainty, use of an infallible method. We're stressed out, we don't know the truth, we need certainty about this topic, and we're going to identify this particular infallible method for achieving that certainty. It's the same thing. Why? Because all of this is modern. This is all in the water for what modernity is. So it's not just in the scientific revolution and rationalism, all these philosophers and all this kind of stuff. It's in the religion too. The same thing is happening in the religion. Parallel. They're parallel things. So this is the irony, is that the Bible thumper and the like atheist skeptic of today, they have their siblings intellectually. They have the same heritage. And that's very uncomfortable to both of them, I'm sure, because they hate each other. They've been trained to hate each other. But they have the same imaginative framework about how to think about epistemology, which is not at all a pre-modern epistemology. We're going to get more into this as we go. We're going to go to break now, but I want to say before we do stream this show on multiple platforms. And if you're not, I have to remind everybody because this has been complicated. If you're not listening to the show on Substack, you're missing a third of the episodes. So go to zacharyporcu.substack.com. There's a link in the description. There's a bunch more content for the roots of everything. There's 2 more episodes for every series. There's like bonus episodes. I post my long form lectures there. Most of it's free. Just check it out. And I will see you guys after the break. How do you explain the sacraments? It's easy to say they're mysteries that we have to take on faith or on the authority of tradition, but that is not how the early Christians understood them. To them, and to all ancient people, the idea that physical objects had spiritual power was very intuitive, whereas modern people tend to find this difficult, bizarre, or even unchristian. This is because we live in an era shaped by secularism, a way of viewing the world that's incompatible with sacramental thinking. Because secular ideas are at the heart of our culture, modern people tend to think in secular ways without realizing it, even the most well-meaning of us. How then do we live in, but not be of, a secular culture? We need to understand the enchanted, sacramental way that the early Christians viewed the world, but we also need to understand secularism. What is it really? Where did it come from? And how does it influence how we think about religion? Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age breaks down these important issues in accessible, non-academic language and is an ideal introduction for young readers, catechumens, and seekers, as well as for any Orthodox Christians who want to deepen their understanding of the sacraments.
Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age by Zachary Porcu. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
Welcome back. I'm seeing Father Deacon Ananias in the comments, which is, hi, I haven't seen you in years. And hi to everybody else in the comments. I'm seeing everybody here on YouTube, and that seems like that's going fine. How are we doing on Substack? Seems like we're okay. Okay, so are you guys with me so far? Or are we following all of this? I know this is an abstract concept, but it is very important, obviously, because it frames the entire imaginative framework for how you view the world today. Isn't that my whole show? Yes, but epistemology is especially important because it's the thing nobody thinks about, and yet it's sort of the most baseline way that you think about things. How do I know this? How do I believe this? Do I believe this? If somebody comes up to you and says, the government's been hiding XYZ thing from you, then you're like, if your reaction is, okay, you're a crazy person, you're a conspiracy theorist, that means you have one set of imaginative framework. And if you go like, okay, that's probably true, I'm ready to believe that, that means you have a different imaginative framework set, and those form subcultures in our culture about how we think of things. Okay, so back to the Reformation, and we're going to tie all this together. Greetings from St. Andrew. Hi. Kane Tapia. I'm not recognizing your handle, but that's okay. Again, hello everyone. I love when people join in chat. Don't be shy. There's plenty to argue about, as we do sometimes. Okay, so the Reformation, same parallelisms that we're seeing with Descartes, because it's in the water. Why is it in the water? We'll talk about that next week. But let's keep going forward from the Reformation, from Luther up to Descartes. So the new method for religion, that it's primarily has its source in a text. Just go to the Bible. Just read the Bible. What's wrong with you? Then you'll know how to be a Christian. Did this work? Did this work as a solution for Christianity? The answer is no. And I think that is kind of obvious / indisputable when you think about it. Like, how could you say that the Reformation succeeded in providing this new epistemology? And if you remember last week, I said, okay, Descartes wants to, he's obsessed with certainty. He wants to use a method to fix the certainty problem. Does it work? No, it actually leads to the complete breakdown of belief in the 20th century later. Same thing with Luther and the Reformation. Does it work? And the answer is no. And in a very simple argument, I don't like getting into all these polemics with people, internet arguments, and so on. But just a very simple, cut to the point kind of answer is, if the problem with Christianity at that point was a lack of adherence to the text of the Bible, what you would expect following the Reformation is increasing unity among Christians. It's like, oh, we had the wrong standard. Now we have the right standard. Oh, phew, great. Now we can all get on the same page. Is that what happened? No, that's not what happened. That's quite the opposite happened, in fact. We went from having sort of vaguely 3 denominations, maybe if you even want to call it that, like Catholic Orthodox and Coptics, sort of, who are all doing 85% the same thing anyway, from a certain perspective. Not that there aren't systemic differences that aren't important, yada, yada. But you sort of have 2.5 different versions of Christianity, and then you go from add a 0, another 0, and then 2 more zeros. So you go up 5 orders of magnitude in number of denominations following this. I just don't know how you say anything other than, okay, I guess being on the same page about the Bible wasn't the problem. Now we have a new problem. So Brad Gregory, I'm going to go back to this guy. He wrote The Unintended Reformation. He said that making the Bible the central authority for the religion, quote, produced not even rough agreement, but an open-ended welter of competing and incompatible interpretations. Immediately, Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and all these guys did not agree on things. They just did not agree. And they argued. And the things, you can read the things Luther wrote about these guys and that wrote about each other. And it was just, very polemical. That was like the internet arguing of the time. They were not kind to each other, let's put it that way. And the reason this quote matters, excuse me, is that it's often the case, I find, that people think, oh, Protestantism, it started out as this single movement away from Catholicism, and then it slowly drifted off into different communions over time. This is just not what happened historically. This is just not what happened. Here's another quote from Brad Gregory. Quote, he said, people often say this, quote, as if there was ever some point in the early Reformation where anti-Roman Christians had agreed among themselves about what Scripture said and God taught. There wasn't. There wasn't. There was no point. This is another thing people don't know. There was no point at the beginning of the Reformation where all the anti-Catholic reformers were just 100% on the same page about everything, about Scripture and theology. They just weren't. There was no point of unity from the beginning, and there hasn't been one since among Protestants. You can say, oh, Protestants say X. It's maybe, just depends. There's no way to generalize it because the beliefs are so varied. So we can say more about what happened with the Reformation from there, but what's the takeaway? What's kind of the point of all this? Is that one way to simply think about the change in religion from prior to the Reformation to after the Reformation is like this. Religion in the West used to be a way of life. That's what religion is. Religion is not a set of beliefs. It's not primarily that. Obviously, beliefs are involved. You need to believe certain things. But that's not primarily what religion is. In the West, in the modern secularized West, because of this history, we tend to think religion is something like your opinion on stuff, on God. Like, do you think that God exists? Do you think that aliens exist? Do you think that Atlantis was real or not? It's like, it's kind of understood as this set of opinions about esoteric things that's kind of fun to talk about, but that nobody really knows the answer to. That's what modern people think religion is. That is not what religion was for all of human history and every single culture prior to ours, by the way. Religion is a way of life. It's your worldview put into a pattern of living, into a pattern of being. You live your being forward because that's your worldview. That's all religion is. Scholars don't have a consensus definition for religion because they think, well, is Confucianism a religion in the same way that Christianity is? It's like, these are secular problems. Religion just means a worldview that you put into practice. So this is why we say, I've said this before, I use the gym religiously. It's like, well, there's your lifestyle. You see, we understand this intuitively. Okay, that's previous to the Reformation. After the Reformation, what happens? Religion becomes a problem of knowledge. How do I know, oh my gosh, the Bible, interpreting the Bible this is what I have to do to be a Christian. Okay, well, how do I interpret it correctly? Well, Luther says this, and the Dutch Calvinists say this, and the Anabaptists say this, and it's like they all have this is the right way to interpret the Bible. So I'm actually going to quote myself here, just not for any reason other than I wrote a paper on this. I did my master's work on this topic, actually, and so I'll just quote this here for you. So I write, in traditional Christianity, doctrine was largely settled for the lay practitioner, and what was chiefly required was the working out of one's salvation with fear and trembling. That is, a concern with Christianity as a life lived. Personal and community prayer, fasting, giving alms, works of mercy and charity, clothing the poor, etc. With the breakdown of doctrinal unity, the issue became chiefly about sorting through competing truth claims to discover the correct reading of the Bible. Meaning, it used to be that Christianity was this thing that was a life lived, mostly about doing stuff and living out your life. And after the Reformation, it became intellectualized. It became this thing. We don't tend to think of Protestantism as intellectual, but compared to, your illiterate saint from the 8th century or whatever, who can't read, so therefore has never read the Bible, but can walk on water and miraculously heal people, it's like this is totally different fixation. The Reformation becomes fixated on knowledge, on knowing and interpreting things correctly. Now, this is a big shift, obviously, but I want to give you one more very important comparison to Descartes so that you get a sense for how all of these cultural factors influence the world you live in today. What is that factor? This is what's going on with Descartes and Luther, is that both of them want to have certainty about the external world or religion or whatever. But what they both lean to is radical individualism and subjectivity. So what's subjectivity or relativism or whatever? This means subjectivity is like the opposite of objectivity. This is objective. We know the boiling point of water. What's subjective? The best pizza shop in town. I deliberately picked a fight with my New York cousins because I walked up to them one time at Christmas and I was like, so what's the best bagel place in the city? And they all just had a giant argument. And I just sat there eating popcorn. Hilarious, because they're New Yorkers. And so the best bagel place in the city is an issue of some great practical importance, and high energy opinions were brought forth about this. But that's largely subjective. That's what people think of. It's like, well, it's taste. So, it's based on the subject. Or you could say it's relative, not objective. It's relative to each individual person, has a different opinion about the best bagel. So what happens? What happens? Descartes, because he is concerned about the certainty of the external world, because he does not trust that the external world is real, and he does not trust that his senses are interpreting the external world correctly, because of this, he has to create this weird method. But you noticed last week his method was, I am an individual subject trapped in my own head, armed with pure reason. It's just me and reason working it out. So in other words, the starting place is the subject. There's no objective starting place. It's just a personal, subjective starting place. And the fact that he's using reason doesn't help exactly, doesn't make it objective, because the unstated but assumed starting place is the subject using reason. That's the starting place. If you read Descartes, the first thing he lands on is, I think, therefore I am. So that's the hook that he's going to hang his hat on. That's the foundation that he's going to build everything off of, the individual subject. So no wonder, fast forward 500 years, we have radical subjectivity and relativism about beliefs, because people, the only thing we trust, since our heritage is Descartes, is myself. You don't trust other people. You don't trust what you hear. You don't trust blah, blah. It's like, what can I learn with my reason? We don't trust authority. We don't trust religion. We don't trust anything. The same thing, I'm sorry to say, is going on in the Reformation. You probably already drew this conclusion. Luther is sitting there anxious about this thing. He's searching the Bible to figure it out. And then his interpretation of a particular verse, because that's not the only interpretation of that verse, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. That's a very niche, very specific interpretation of that verse that he comes up with. It's very personal. It's personal to Luther and his anxiety. It's relative to him. It's subjective. Because what do we got? We got Luther in a corner by himself with his method, the Bible. We got Descartes in a corner by himself with his method, reason. They're doing the same thing. And so because their starting point is ultimately subjectivity, the individual subject, not the community, not tradition, not saints, not revelation, not the external world, none of those things, the subject plus a method equals certainty, that's the formula, then it's no wonder that the Reformation, just like the Enlightenment that follows, the Enlightenment that follows Descartes, leads to radical individual subjectivity. And that's what we're getting at when we're talking about why there's so many denominations of Protestantism, because it's almost like you have, there's jokes Protestants even make about this. I went to a Baptist school and I heard these kind of jokes. What was the joke? If you get 10 Baptists together in a room and you ask them a question about theology, you're going to get 11 answers. And, you know, the joke is just like, no, everyone has a different opinion about all of this stuff. Well, yeah, because it's subjectivity, because it's centered in the subject. So you get as many answers as there are people. And the joke is, you know, maybe one more. It's superlative. So no community, no tradition, no authority. In either case, Descartes or Luther, and this is going to be a problem. I'm picking on religion in this episode, Western religion, but this is going to be a problem for the atheists and the skeptics and the deists that come later in the next episode. The Enlightenment's going to try to build a new religion, and it's going to fall completely apart, and you already know it's fallen completely apart, just like the attempted unity of Christendom falls completely apart, because the same thing is going on. So here's another quote from Brad Gregory. He says, as a result, today, quote, large numbers of religious believers themselves, influenced by these cultural currents and the desire to be inoffensive, that's very important to us, in effect, relativize and subjectivize their own truth claims, making clear that they speak only for themselves, base their opinions only on their own experience, or choose their religious community based ultimately on what they like and what makes them comfortable. That's the fallout for religion, obviously, but also for everything else, also for all secular non-religious people. And what's funny is that these are often the same people, because you get these people. I know so many people who are raised evangelical and now they're atheists or skeptics. And they were yelled at about the Bible, the Bible, the Bible. You got to follow the method of the Bible. And then they became teenagers and they were like, actually, none of this makes any sense, which is true, because a pure, basic, like, Bible as the source of truth thing doesn't, it kind of falls apart whatever direction you push on it. And we've talked about that plenty on the show. And if you've read my book, you know all these arguments. But then those people go, okay, well, instead of abandoning the idea that the individual subject plus a method is how you arrive at certainty, they just go from biblical literalism to scientific, what we would call technically like naive scientism, meaning the belief that science is actually the objective method that can help the individual subject bridge the gap of certainty. Like, in other words, they're kind of the same thing, and they're often the same people. People who are burned out evangelicals or Protestants become so many people I meet who are skeptics and atheists now. But the methodology, the epistemology, is the same. We don't have certainty. We're going to bridge it with this method. It's just that science is a better method than the Bible. And then these two people get in all these fights. And then they come to an Orthodox person, and the Orthodox person is like, I don't really know what to say here, because we don't have this belief in method. And we don't use these categories of objective and subjective like you guys do. And we're going to talk about those differences later. So, in other words, I mean, maybe that's helpful to those of you who maybe come up with a atheist worldview or a skeptical worldview because you were frustrated with evangelicalism. It's like, okay, I hear you. I was frustrated with it too growing up, but that's not actually what Christianity is. Like, the overwhelming minority of people historically have been of that position. The overwhelming majority of all Christians have been Catholic or Orthodox in human history. So it's actually a minority position, which doesn't seem like that if you grew up in certain parts in America, but there you are. Okay, so let's try to tie all of this together. Again, and let me say real quick, I'm not trying to be mean. I have evangelical friends. I love them. I have skeptic friends. I love them. It's just, we want to be real about what our cultural heritage is and what our imaginative framework is, so that we can kind of talk through these things and understand what's going on. Because if you're here, you want to know, I assume, what the truth of things is. And my hope is that we can have some intellectual tools to bridge these gaps. And part of that, a huge part of that, I mean, to me, the most helpful part of that is historical context. Why did these conversations happen, and how do they come to influence you today? Welcome to our channel. I see some things going on in chat. Even though atheists claim not to believe in God, they hold a lot of the same values as theists. Yes, that's what I'm saying. That our values as modern secular Westerners are really the same. So another way of putting this historically, and a lot of scholars will say this, is that Protestantism has a straight line to modern atheism. Like, the modern atheism, skepticism, and scientism is the daughter of the Reformation. The Reformation is her mother. I'm personifying this. This is how the people talk about these movements. They have the same heritage. And you don't really escape the epistemic categories, meaning the epistemological categories of atheism, by going back to evangelical Protestantism. You don't get out of it. This is why evangelical Protestants constantly lose culturally to atheists and to skeptics and to secularists, because the whole thing is secular, especially from an Orthodox perspective, but from any ancient perspective. So anyway, we'll do more of that. Okay, so there's another element here that I should remind you of. If you've watched previous series, then you know about we talked about the wars of religion, which are not really wars of religion. They're the wars of the nation states, but they use religion as a way to have an excuse to command loyalty and to butcher each other. And this leads to the 30 Years' War and many, many other wars in Europe at the time. We did a whole episode on this in the first series, the Secularism series, which was just on the birth of secularism. So this series is kind of parallel to it. And the whole key to that was the Reformation allows you to make your own religion. And so if you can make up your own religion, you can make up your own state religion. If you're France, you make Catholicism part of the French state. If you're German, you make Lutheranism. If you're English, you make the Church of England, Anglicanism. So it's like, as soon as people realize you can just make up your own religion, it can be relative, they make it what? Relative to the state. They harness this power of religious language and then, boom, use it to coerce and fight one another. And it leads to the wars of religion, and Europe is bathed in blood, and it's a massive tragedy. I think it's the bloodiest war in European history up to that point, and it's not even close. So that's bad. And no wonder people lost their faith after this. I argued in that episode that this led to the secularization of Europe because people said to themselves, we cannot use religion to organize society because we don't agree on it. So we have to use something else to organize society. We have to have values that everyone can agree on regardless of their religion. So they kick religion out of the public sphere and create secularism. This is the birth of the secular states. And it's coming off the heels of the Reformation. This is what the Reformation causes. Now, you could be more cynical, which is always fine. And you could say, well, the Reformation was encouraged and even funded by secular state powers who really wanted to stop being answerable to the Catholic Church. I think that's true too. There's not one factor. These are all factors. The secular states are emerging. They don't want to be morally accountable. And you might think oh, yes, if you have an anti-Catholic bias, you think, oh, yeah, Catholics, stupid Catholics, we need the state to be free from their influence. Well, that doesn't work very well. If you want to know more about that, go back to my series on both the secular state and the birth of secularism, because I'll just say this for now. You have to think about what it means to say, I don't want states to have moral accountability. Really think about if that's what you want. Oh, no moral accountability. And the answer can't be, well, how could they have moral accountability? Don't be defeatist about it. Just think about it in an abstraction, at a base level. Should states have moral accountability? And if the answer is no, then you get what we have now. Secular states, and you get the 20th century, and you get genocide and nuclear bombs and concentration camps, and that's what that means. That's the wars of the 20th century, is what it means to have states with no moral accountability. So when you look at the emerging nation states of this period saying yeah, we want to make up our own religion so we're not accountable to a transnational authority like the Catholic Church, you shouldn't just be applauding, oh, of course. It's no, that's, and you don't have to be Catholic to agree with this. But the whole movement away from a moral authority that transcends particular national interests and unifies Europe should be a little sus in your mind. And that, don't just give that a free pass. That's another topic. Listen to that series. Okay. So that's how the Reformation leads to the secularization of Europe, yada, yada, yada. But we still have this epistemic problem. We still haven't solved the problem of certainty. Descartes' question has not really been answered, and we're going to see that in the next 2 centuries, which we're going to do next week. And Luther's problem about how to make religion clear and unifying fails. I think it just obviously fails. Now there's no... Somebody stops you on the street and says, let me tell you about Jesus. You have no idea what this person is going to say. I have no idea what this person is going to say because it could be anything. It could be anything. So, and that's the world we live in. So, to sum all of this up, there's Descartes and Luther, like I said, they're both obsessed with certainty. They both believe a method is going to save them. They ground the method in the subjective individual. Me and my reason, me and my Bible. Same thing from an epistemology standpoint. And this leads to subjectivity because it starts with subjectivity. It starts with the subject and the method are the only things that can be trusted. So if I were to overgeneralize, as I'm underpaid to do, you could say that all the movements of modernity are in some sense an attempt to solve these problems and save Europe from chronic doubt. And it's chronic doubt in everything, in science, in logic, and in religion alike. All of these things are problems. It's not like Descartes said, let's just use reason, and then everything was fine from there. It leads to a huge crisis. To David Hume, to Immanuel Kant, to Hegel, to all these things. If you're a philosophy person, you know kind of where this story goes. And the end of that story is postmodernism. And if you listen to Jordan Peterson, whoever, like postmodernism, I think he kind of popularized, he brought this to more modern people's attention. Postmodernism is this idea that there's no truth. There's only power. And this is a very dangerous idea, obviously. So that's where this goes historically. And so if you want, you can frame all of the next 500 years of human history in the West around Descartes and Luther trying to solve the problem of skepticism and certainty through methods, and the methods failed. So next week, we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give you a quick preview so you know where this is going. Next week, we're going to talk about the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment is what comes next, historically. The Enlightenment is this attempt to rebuild a plausibility structure and a knowledge, some kind of knowledge basis that we can have faith in for Europe. And they want to do a secular version of that because religion just destroyed Europe, and so they don't want to go back to that. So we're going to talk about everything that's going on with the Enlightenment next week, including Immanuel Kant, who you may know of. I'm going to translate him. I'm going to communicate him to you in a comprehensible way. He's not a very good writer. Then the next week, we're going to talk about how all of this breaks down and culminates in the 20th century. And then on episodes 5 and 6, we're going to talk about, okay, what exactly is wrong with Descartes and this whole doubt project, and what's a better way to do this? What's a better way to think about it? Because if you figure out what's wrong with him, then we can go to, okay, well, what should he have done? What were the flaws? What should we be doing now? And how can we on the ground think about science and logic and religion in ways that are reasonable and not neurotic, and we don't have to be obsessed with certainty in these ways? How, why, we'll talk all about it. And we'll conclude with also, what do we do with religion, and what exactly is going on with religious epistemology? How do you know things? This is a question we talk about a lot in catechism, and it's very similar to the questions people ask about science and rationalism. How do we know things with reason? How do we know things with science? How do we know religious things? Well, because we're Westerners and this is our heritage, those are all the same problem, like it or not. Sorry if you're you're a skeptic mad at evangelicalism, or you're an evangelical mad at atheism. It's like, well, we're going to need to get through this together. So they're all the same kind of issue, and they're going to have similar solution. So I'm looking forward to that. And that's basically going to be today's episode. However, we're doing a new thing. We're starting a new thing right now. You may notice we're streaming this on YouTube and Spotify and Substack and all that stuff. What we're going to do right now is an after party. So there's just so much content that I want to give to you guys, and there's so much chat interaction that people have, that I want to jump to an after party live video, and which I'm just going to do audience interaction with you guys. So if I didn't get to your question in the chat and you want to chat more, hop on over to the after party. It's going to start in 10 minutes. It's going to start at 2:10. The editor is posting a link in the chat right now on YouTube, but you can go to zacharyporcu.substack.com. It should be on the front page, or it should be showing up on the front page in about 10 minutes from now. So take a little break, walk around, stretch, grab some water, and then come hang out. It's free. Just come on over and we'll keep chatting. And if my editors are feeling feisty, they may bring up some additional topics, and we'll just do a little bit of a deep dive for about 20 minutes. So come hang out. And if you miss either this or that after party, this video or that after party, they're both going to be archived on Substack, and you can watch them later. And if I don't see you in 10 minutes, which I hope I do, then I'll see you next week, in which we get into the Enlightenment, or should I say the Endarkenment? That's not a word. We'll figure it out next week. So Any case, thank you guys for joining me on this listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio, and I will see you